And thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this talk. So the title of the talk is Modeling Minds and Managing the Cost of Functioning. This is a reworking of a previous talk that Kavita had invited me to do at UIS. And as I tweaked the title and then started doing the slides, I realized that the title sounds a little bit clickbaity, so I apologize for that. What I'm just going to start by is just outlining, normally when I do these talks, I'd like to focus on talking about the elephant in the room. And this is a deliberate choice of picture, because most of the time when we're talking about mental health and, well, individual suffering, resilience, etc., the elephant in the room, or the elephants in the room, are discrimination, inequality, workload. These are the things that we don't quite talk about as the various systemic issues that are a critical factor in the problems that people deal with. And those include misogyny, sexism, racism, ableism, and that's not an exhaustive list. But as we were preparing this talk, Kavita also reminded me of the elephant that's sitting on our chests at the moment, which is COVID-19, and the impact that that's had on our lives. So what I'm going to do in this talk is focus a little bit more on what our lives have been like over the last year with the COVID-19 pandemic. Up front, I just want to make clear that there's one thing that this talk will not be about, and that is tips. I completely understand that very often people are hoping that talks like this will offer some useful tips on how to deal with, what people are suffering with. It's never really been my approach, because I think we're always dealing with very complex problems, and we're constantly being sold very simplistic solutions for those complex problems. And the fact that that there are no simple solutions for this is that you're all familiar with these sort of ads. One tip to cut belly fat, one tip to reduce wrinkles. But even those guys don't go for one tip to improve your mental health, right? Because that's something that even those peddlers have decided nobody is going to really fall for. And in fact, if you just Google one weird tip for improving your mental health, you get 31 tips. And 31 tips is really a program. Okay. The second thing that this talk isn't going to be about is it's not going to be something like these articles. So these are articles from Forbes and the BBC website about how to avoid burnout amid a pandemic. And again, I think, these are well-meaning and helpful lists. I'm not really sure how helpful they are to most people, but if you want them, they're out there. This one's available, like I said, on the BBC website. The other one is from Forbes. It's by Margie Worrell, who emboldens people to live and lead more bravely. And that is something that I can hand on heart say I have never done. There isn't a single person I've emboldened to live and lead bravely. Okay, but instead, what this talk will try to be about is acknowledging the reality of our current situation, trying to describe some important aspects of how we are suffering, and making sense of how we're being affected, and hopefully pleading for some compassion and self-compassion. So I've chosen to highlight some particular aspects of our current reality. And in many ways, these are sort of magnifications and exaggerations of problems that we've had to contend with well before the pandemic. But some specific things to emphasize is that there seems to be generally a widespread acknowledgement that we simply can't do everything like we used to before the pandemic. But despite that acknowledgement, the reality largely is we still have to do everything we used to do, but with less support. The second is that we have even less control over our immediate worlds than we used to have. We're constantly having to make decisions as to how best to survive now or the immediate short term, very aware that there may be only partly foreseen consequences in the future that we don't know and can do little to mitigate. And one example, not an exclude, but one example is the decisions that parents are having to make about children, schooling, juggling work. How much are you able to keep up with homeschooling? Do you send your children back to school? And I think those are very, very difficult calls to make, and you don't quite know what the future consequences of those are going to be. And these and many other decisions that we end up having to make a lot of on a daily basis do add to the workload that we are already carrying. And this is something that some writers talk about as decision fatigue. The other was that when we went into this situation in March, many of us were able to make plans for how we might survive a couple of months. But it's very difficult now that things have been going on for a year for those kind of plans to hack it for that period. I just wonder, when I say many of us made plans, an important thing to acknowledge is that, as I said, the pandemic and everything that's come with it has really emphasized and exaggerated existing inequalities or pre-existing inequalities. So a lot of people have to work very hard just to survive, and there are sadly a lot of people who haven't been able to do that. There are vital supports, resources, benefits, and even personal strengths that we had to count on before that have either been lost or have been worn down over the last year. But on the other hand, previous disadvantages and inequities have only become more marked. And after a year, the new normal, at least from my perspective, seems to increasingly become more and more like the old normal in terms of the expectations that we place on people. And this is, I think, one of the key issues to me, that there's been a massive blurring for many of us between our work and our non-work selves. Earlier, the structure of work allowed us to compartmentalize those parts of our life much better, and those parts of our identity much better. But when you're working from home and when you're dealing with additional responsibilities like managing homeschooling, while at the same time trying to keep up your regular work, those two selves or those two aspects of your life blur a lot more. And that makes things really difficult. And I'll highlight this in a few of the other areas that I'm going to cover. A slightly broader issue is that it's quite difficult, at least I find, to trust that the major things will be taken care of in the world. And here I'm essentially referring to some, I think, completely legitimate and serious concerns we have about the systems that are meant to be looking after us at a national level, to know that actually the pandemic is being appropriately managed and there is a way forward out of this. Then there have been losses that people have incurred, and these have been losses of loved ones, and as well as losses of jobs, opportunities, interest, aspects of one's identity that one has simply had to carry through because there simply hasn't been the time or the space to process them or deal with them. And while you can think about making up for time and opportunity lost, when you're thinking about a couple of months, it becomes a lot harder when you're thinking about it's a year. And of course, there's been a lot of illness and disability, both new and worsening of previous illness and disability, as people have lost out on routine care and having existing problems tended to quickly enough. And really, the future and the way out are unclear. Now, when I mention these sort of things, it always, well, understandably, it sort of feels like this is all a bit doom and gloom. But the one thing that I don't like doing in these sort of talks is doing the sort of usual media spin that we need to look at the bright side, we need to come up with a positive outlook. And I think when people are suffering, actually, you have to acknowledge the reality of what they're suffering. Trying to put a positive spin on things that are difficult always feels a bit disingenuous to me. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is, of course, that in the particular setting, it's the inequality, power, and intersectionality remain major concerns. And like I said, a lot of these inequalities have been worsened by the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic. I increasingly feature this in a lot of my talks, but this is just highlighting some of the main systems of power that we are dealing with in the world, and the university works as a perfect microcosm of the world when you're thinking about these power systems. The systems are predominantly ableist, patriarchal, white, heterosexual, cisgender, and I choose the word capitalist here, but it's essentially thinking in terms of people's value to a system or towards an output. And I want to just mention two examples here with regards to COVID-19, and one is the impact on women and girls. This is from the WHO report from April last year, talking about the disproportionate impact on women and girls, both in terms of economic impacts, the cost to health, the cost of unpaid care work, and an increase in gender-based violence over the course of the pandemic. But something that is very strong, very keenly felt, certainly in the academic world and in the university world, is the disproportionate impact there has been on women when it has come to caring for children and caring for elderly family during the pandemic. Now, that's completely expected given the way that the world operates. But I want to just highlight that this is from a report from April 2020. And this is a paper from May of last year about what's happening to women academics during the pandemic. The point I wanted to emphasize in particular here is that, at this point, when these two documents came out, we were just a few months into the pandemic, and it was already clear that there was going to be a massive impact. We're close to a year down the line from there, and a lot more has certainly happened to exacerbate those issues, but I'm not sure there's very much that's happened to try and correct them. And I'm very aware of the sort of stresses that my female colleagues are experiencing at this time. Well, through this period in particular, sorry. The other example I want to highlight is the impact, on ethnic minority groups, where, again, it's been very clear that there's been a lot more morbidity and mortality in ethnic minority groups. They've suffered greater financial impact. There's been worsening social inequality. There's been disproportionate exposure to the infection, and a lot more blaming, particularly for one particular example is around the context of vaccine hesitancy. Why are people from ethnic minorities hesitant to take the vaccine? Which is, again, being considered in a completely cross-sectional light and not really taking into account the fact that ethnic minorities have good reason to be suspicious of vaccines and top-down medical programs, given what they've been subjected to and how they've been discriminated against them in the past. Okay, I wanted to mention, because I think these are all things that we're dealing with, and I don't know what the audience for the talk is like, but I'm sure there are people amongst you who have noticed the impact of these factors and features on your lives. That's my sort of background. I'm going to go into talking about a particular model of thinking about functioning that I tend to use in these talks. And I want to just emphasize, this is just a model as a way of trying to make sense of and help understand what we go through. And this is about thinking about our functioning. And we live in systems where both we and other people evaluate our functioning as, in terms of its own measure, its own output. And we do the same for ourselves. But I think when you think about functioning or functioning deteriorating for whatever reason, that's quite an incomplete picture, because if you want to think about functioning, you've got to think about the cost of functioning. And you can think about this as, how much energy do you have to expend to do the stuff that you need to do every day? And we bear the cost of that functioning out of a tank, a reserve that we have. And if you think about what the elements of that functioning are day to day, they include things like mental multitasking and planning in time, attention and concentration, decision making, emotional processing and interaction, cognitive control, processing and navigating the world. And this is what we're doing all the time. These demands obviously fluctuate depending on what's happening, what else that we've got going on. But on the other side, the bit that sort of helps keep the reserve replenished are rest and routine, social interaction and leisure, predictability of our lives, supports and fulfillment that we find. And the situation we've lived in the last year is one in which the demands on the right have gone up considerably in varying ways, whereas the supports or the things that would feed our reserve on the left have been lost to a lesser or greater extent for most people. Lockdown, isolation, the closure of public spaces, loss of interactions and contacts with family members, all those things we've sort of lost. And in the normal case where you're sort of living a balance between these, here what you're experiencing is a far greater demand on the right, with relatively little return or recovery from the left side of the equation. So when we think about functioning in terms of its cost, functioning doesn't really usually tend to drop till the cost reaches a point where you can no longer sustain the cost. And it's quite easy to spot the signs of the cost increasing. One feels increasingly worn out, one feels less efficient, you have less capacity for patience, for empathy, less capacity for dealing with the unexpected. You've got everything lined up for the day as you thought it was going to happen, but that one thing turned up, that one email popped up, that one deadline that suddenly somebody dropped on your desk. Your child just won't be bothered, can't be bothered to sit down to do that lesson that they needed to do for you to get that half hour to recover or do whatever else you needed to, and you find that actually I just cannot cope with this. We find ourselves feeling more irritable. It takes longer to recover, so you spend the evenings recovering from the days, the weekends recovering from the weeks, and you come to Monday morning and you're still feeling completely wiped out. That's become even more marked as our work lives and our non-work lives have become blurred, because if you're working from home and you're homeschooling your children, then weekdays and weekends blur a lot more into each other. You lose spontaneity or the capacity for spontaneity in life because there simply isn't the reserve to do that. And over time, there's an increasing anticipatory weariness or dread of things that one got to do. And we start to make decisions on shorter timescales, and we start living on shorter timescales. It's about getting through this day, getting through this week, getting through this week, getting through this day, getting through this meeting. And these are things that we'll all be familiar with from periods of our lives where we have been under considerable stress, or the demand of work or competing demands has been so much that we're pretty much running on fumes. But I think the situation that we've been in the last year is sort of a magnification of this. So you can get to a point where actually your reserve gets depleted, and increasingly you're using all the energy you have to maintain a certain level of functioning. And this is what happens quite commonly in people with chronic illnesses. But I do wonder, and it's quite hard to get a sense of this from the data at the moment, as to how many of us are spending a fair bit of time in this kind of position. And therefore, it's probably relevant at this point to bring up the phenomenon of burnout, which is very comparable to what I've just talked about. So burnout is defined in the International Classification of Diseases as follows. So the International Classification of Diseases is a WHO document that describes all the various medical conditions, social conditions, occupational conditions that are formally recognized. And according to the ICD-11, the burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is characterized by three dimensions: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, reduced professional efficacy. As I read that, I'm mindful that I and probably several others have at points in their jobs thought, well, this is just normal. But yeah, burnout refers to a sustained state of that. But the ICD has this little caveat that burnout refers specifically to phenomena in the occupational context and should not be applied to describe experiences in other areas of life. Okay, and I think this becomes a lot more complicated when the divide between work and the rest of life becomes more blurred. Working from home can have its advantages, can have its conveniences, but can also mean that you're always at work. And so I think while we can talk about burnout as an occupational phenomena, I don't think it would be unfair to say that there are some of us, or many of us along the way at times, who have been burnt out by the job of parenting. So how does one manage the cost? Now, usually the way one manages the additional cost is by encouraging a major time cost. Things take longer to do. And of course, this makes things even more difficult because part of your problem is usually that you don't have enough time. And if the things you need to do are taking more time, you get stuck in a really vicious cycle. You incur an opportunity cost in that some things have to be let go. Some opportunities just have to be passed up. You can try various innovations and alternatives, but very often what you're working with is a rather fixed amount that you can play with. You can make various adjustments, accommodations, and aids. And in fact, I think we tend to get a lot of these, such suggestions from workplaces, from self-help books, articles, and so on. And they can certainly be helpful. The other is that the other way you manage it is that you just live with the fact that the cost is so much and the cost will be variable, or a more sustainable or sustained change is to try and limit what one does. Now, I've taken this from my talk on unseen disabilities because this is what people with disabilities or chronic illnesses are having to do all the time, but it's getting a lot closer to what most of us or many of us are having to do at this time. So the other thing that I want to sort of emphasize is that while this pictorial representation looks like we're thinking about a particular cross-section, really we're thinking about people over time. The cost of functioning goes up over time. At varying points, you may find yourself along any one of these boxes. But equally, as time goes on, you may find yourself somewhere here. And really, in terms of trying to claw your way back, the one thing that you can try and do is see, can you cut the cost? And that usually means having to give up on something, at least temporarily, to make the space, to then recover the space and recover your reserve. But it's difficult when, in a situation like we're living in now, life doesn't really let up. Okay, I'm going to just come to the bit of the talk that was actually outlined right at the start, which is the task of modeling minds. And really the reason I talk about this is ultimately, I think one of the few things that is vital for us to do is to focus on compassion for others and compassion for ourselves. And that requires some thinking about other minds and our own minds. So when we think about, this is the typical empathy question in medicine, how would I feel if I was in this person's shoes? When what we really want to know is, how does this person feel in their shoes? And how I would feel in this person's shoes is potentially knowable, but it relies on two assumptions. And one is that, my mind is sufficiently similar to the other person's mind. And two, I've got a sufficiently accurate reading of what it's like to be in this person's shoes. Now, again, this gets a little tricky when the boundaries between work self and non-work self start to blur, because it now becomes part of our lives that our colleagues, our bosses, our line managers know a lot more about what's happening in our lives, because that's just become necessary. You need to tell people that you're homeschooling, you're looking after this, you're managing 2 people working from home. But just because you know more, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got that accurate. And the question of how somebody else feels in their shoes may not really be knowable, but that's the bit that you really want to try and get to. Now, this is always sort of hindered by some difficult societal beliefs that we've got. One is that my experience and of my own and others' minds doesn't capture the totality of all mental experience, but it does it reasonably well. And I can think about other minds if I just take away bits of my mind or add other bits that I don't normally have. And given enough time and knowledge, I can understand what it would be like to be in someone's mind. And therefore, and related to that, I need to understand what it is like for this person in their lives to decide whether, and if so, by how much they need to be helped. The other false belief is that people's experiences can be understood as linear stories that make an overall or overarching sense, and that if you try hard enough, you can ultimately think or make yourselves better or stronger. And the corollary is that people who haven't got better or stronger simply haven't tried hard enough, or some people will not even try and will try and play the system. Again, these are from my unseen disability talk, but again, I think they're sort of relevant here, because what we find is as our circumstances have changed, they increasingly get normalized, and we're back to sort of thinking about the new dramatically altered situation as the new normal, and thus reinstating the ways of thinking from the old normal. So just to come back here again, the question is thinking about how does this person feel in their shoes? And as I said, this is a lot more challenging when our work and non-work selves are so blurred at present. But the real point to emphasize here is, like, you don't need to do this whole job of trying to model other minds. It's great if you can. The most useful hacks for dealing with this are really compassion and self-compassion. Compassion in that I don't quite understand what it's like being you, but I care and I'd like to help, or I care and I'll try to understand. And along with that, self-compassion for oneself about how one is suffering and how one has suffered over time. When I first did the talk at UIS, I outlined this little model from our cognitive therapies about, ways in which we deal with being in the world. So we exist in this pink bubble where we have beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world. And we live in the world as it is, and the world as it is shaped by our beliefs. And I think some major, and the ways that one can deal with difficult situations are, one can think about reshaping the world, or changing one's beliefs, or changing the way we act in the world, or changing the way the world acts upon us. And I was just reflecting on this in the current context, and that actually a lot of the things that we thought about the world, and quite possibly a lot of the things that we thought about ourselves, have undergone a major shake-up over the last year. And it's also, I think, made us very, very aware of actually how little control we have on influencing the world around us. And that only emphasizes the sense of helplessness that we always live with, but it feels a lot more close and present in a time like this. So some things that may be helpful to think about is, how much understanding can I get from the world, i.e. mainly work, right? So how much can I get other people to understand about the situation that I'm having to deal with, my individual situation? And the rest is probably up to me to understand. So one example is that, so let's talk about productivity. So how much can my workplace understand that I'm not capable of being as productive as I would have under normal circumstances. And your workplace may only understand so much. And the rest is really up to you to sort of be kind to yourself, to understand, well, fine, if people aren't going to get it, I need to be mindful this is as much as I can do. Again, that I'm very mindful comes from a position of privilege on my part, because a lot of us don't have that option where if other people won't understand, there is very little that we can do when we're up against external demands. Another thing to think about, I mean, what is most important to me and for me? What is the thing that is going to sustain me, fulfill me during a period like this? And what are the things that I really want to keep going? And I put a reminder here, remember the oxygen mask rule, which is that especially when we're looking after other people, and if that's a primary important responsibility, one needs to look after oneself so that one can look after other people. And so the oxygen mask rule is from the airplane safety demo, which is apply your own oxygen mask before helping those around you. And sometimes it's helpful to think about what can I choose to give up, at least temporarily, rather than be forced to give up. And my own thoughts are that after we've dealt with our sort of basic needs, people and relationships are probably the most important resources to reach out to and prioritize. Okay, so this is the concluding message, which is if you only take one thing away from this talk, then you clearly haven't been paying enough attention. That is from the comedian Simon Munnery, and I use this to close most of my talks and sometimes even clinic appointments. Thank you very much.